Story, the room at the end of the hall. In 2018, Daniel Miller moved into an old Victorian house in Maine. He had gotten it for an unbelievably low price, and though the house needed some repairs, he was eager to make it his own. But there was one strange thing about the house. At the very end of the upstairs hallway, there was a door that wouldn't open. The locked door. The door had no key, no visible lock, just a heavy brass handle that wouldn't budge. The previous owner had warned Daniel not to worry about it. "It's just an old storage room. Best to leave it alone." Daniel didn't press for answers, but at night, when the house was silent, he would stare down the hallway at the door that shouldn't be there. And soon, he began to hear sounds coming from the other side. Something inside it started softly, a faint tapping. Then, on some nights, a slow, dragging sound, like something moving across the floor. One night, Daniel pressed his ear against the door. He held his breath. And then, just as he was about to step back, 3 sharp knocks, right against the wood. Daniel stumbled backward, his heart pounding. There was something in that room. The whispering. Over the next few weeks, Daniel tried to ignore the door. But the noises got worse. Late at night, he began to hear whispering, low, urgent whispers, just on the edge of his hearing. He could never make out the words, but the tone was pleading, begging. Then, one night, the whispers spoke his name. "Daniel, let me out." The door opens. That was it. Daniel had to know what was behind that door. He grabbed a crowbar and forced the handle. It took all his strength, but finally, the door creaked open. The room inside was empty. No furniture, no windows, just 4 blank walls and a thick layer of dust. It looked like no one had entered for decades. But as Daniel stepped inside, he felt it. The air was thick, heavy, wrong. And then he saw them. Footprints, not his own. Fresh, deep footprints leading straight to where he stood. Daniel turned to run, and the door slammed shut behind him. The new tenant. 3 months later, the house was back on the market. The new tenant, a woman named Claire, moved in without issue. But on her first night, as she walked up to her bedroom, she noticed something odd. At the very end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. And from inside the dark room, she swore she heard someone breathing. Story, the thing in the vents. In 2022, Chris moved into a small apartment in Chicago. It was old, a little run down, but cheap, exactly what he needed. The only weird thing? The air vents. They were huge, much larger than normal, and ran through every room. The landlord said it was because the building was old and had an outdated heating system. Chris didn't think much of it, until the scratching started. The sounds in the night. The first time he heard it, he was half asleep. A faint, skittering sound coming from the vents, like something crawling inside. Probably just mice, he thought, or rats. It's an old building. But over the next few nights, the sounds got louder. The scratching turned into thumping, then shuffling. And one night, just as he was drifting off, he heard breathing. The whisper in the dark. Chris lay frozen in bed, barely daring to breathe. The sound was soft, but unmistakable. A slow, raspy breath coming from the vent above his bed. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the vent. Two pale eyes stared back at him. Chris screamed and fell out of bed. When he looked back, the eyes were gone. The vent cover was still bolted shut. Something is watching. The next day, Chris told his landlord. The man just shrugged. Yeah, tenants hear weird things sometimes. It's just the pipes. Chris knew that wasn't true. That night, he placed his phone on top of the vent with the camera recording. He left it running while he slept. The next morning, he checked the footage. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Then, at 3:13 a.m., the video glitched. For just a split second, the screen turned to static. Then, a face appeared, pale, hollow eyes, mouth too wide, grinning, and worst of all, it was pressing its face against the vent, staring down at him. Chris slammed his laptop shut. His hands were shaking. That was not a rat. The final night. Chris decided to leave. He packed a bag and booked a hotel. But before he left, he made one mistake. He looked inside the vent. Using a screwdriver, he removed the cover and shined a flashlight inside. The space stretched deep into the walls, disappearing into darkness. Then he saw them. Handprints. Smudged, greasy handprints on the metal, like someone or something had been crawling through the vents. And far, far inside the darkness, something moved. Chris didn't stay to see what it was. He ran, left the apartment, and never came back. The building still stands, new tenants move in, but sometimes late at night they hear scratching in the vents. And if they wake up at just the right moment, they might see the pale eyes watching them through the grate. Story. The Man in the Reflection. In 2019, Olivia moved into a small apartment in Seattle. It was nothing special, just a cheap rental with outdated furniture. The only thing she really liked about it was the antique mirror in the hallway. It was massive, with an ornate gold frame, and it was bolted to the wall as if it had been there for decades. The landlord told her it was original to the building. She thought it was beautiful, until the reflections started changing. The first glimpse. One evening, Olivia walked past the mirror on her way to the kitchen. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw something move. She stopped and turned back, but there was nothing unusual, just her own reflection, probably just her imagination. But as she walked away, she could have sworn she saw another figure standing behind her. The shadow that shouldn't be there. Over the next few weeks, strange things kept happening. Sometimes, as she brushed her teeth, she would glance at the mirror and see her reflection blinking out of sync. Other times, she swore the mirror was darker than it should be, like the room inside was slightly different from the real one. Then, one night, she woke up thirsty and went to get a glass of water. As she passed the mirror, she saw him. A tall man in a black suit, standing inside the reflection. His face was too blurry to make out, but he was watching her. When she spun around to look behind her, there was no one there. She turned back to the mirror. The man was closer. Something is coming through. Olivia covered the mirror with a sheet, but that night, she woke up to a sound. A slow, deliberate tapping. It was coming from behind the mirror. She stared at the sheet, frozen. The tapping grew louder. Then, a whisper. "Let me out." Olivia bolted from the room and spent the night at a friend's place. The hidden message. The next morning, she came back with her friend, Jason. She ripped the sheet off the mirror and screamed. There were handprints on the glass. Not hers. Too large. Too long. Jason grabbed a flashlight and shined it against the mirror at an angle. That's when they saw it. Words. Faintly scratched into the glass, as if written from the other side. "He sees you." Jason helped Olivia take the mirror off the wall. Behind it there was a door. A small wooden door nailed shut. Jason pried it open with a crowbar, and behind it was a pitch-black crawl space. A crawl space with footprints in the dust, footprints that led out of the darkness, but none going back in. The aftermath. Olivia moved out the next day. The mirror stayed behind. The landlord refused to remove it. A few months later, a new tenant moved in. She never saw the man in the mirror, but every night, around 3 a.m., she hears it. A slow tapping on the glass. Story. The smiling thing in the woods. In 2020, James and his best friend Eric went on a weekend camping trip deep in the forests of Montana. They wanted to disconnect from the world. No phones, no distractions, just nature. But the woods had something else waiting for them. The figure by the fire. The first night was peaceful. They set up their tent, built a fire, and sat under the stars. Around midnight, Eric went to relieve himself in the trees. That's when James saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the firelight. It was just a shadow, barely visible beyond the glow. "Eric?" James called. No response. The figure didn't move. Then Eric came back from the other direction. James's stomach dropped. He looked back at the shadowy figure, but it was gone. The laughter in the dark. That night, James struggled to sleep. The tent felt too thin, too vulnerable. Sometime around 2 a.m., he heard it. Soft laughter. It was distant at first, a light, airy giggle, almost childlike. But then it grew closer and closer. James nudged Eric awake. "Do you hear that?" Eric groggily listened. The laughter had stopped. "Dude, you're freaking yourself out," Eric mumbled before rolling over. But James lay awake, heart pounding. Somewhere outside the tent, something was waiting. The wrong smile. The next evening, as the sun set, James walked a short distance to a nearby stream to wash up. That's when he saw something squatting in the water. It looked like a person, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its back hunched. It was scooping water with thin, pale hands. James stepped backward, snapping a twig under his boot. The thing froze. Then slowly it turned its head, way too far, way too smoothly. And it smiled. Not a normal smile. A grin that stretched impossibly wide, as if the skin was about to tear. James ran. The final night. James didn't tell Eric what he saw. He didn't want to sound crazy. But that night, as they sat by the fire, Eric suddenly whispered, "Don't move." James's blood ran cold. "What?" "Behind you," Eric murmured. James turned his head slightly. Something was crouching just outside the fire's glow, watching, smiling. Then it moved, not like a person. It skittered, its limbs bending wrong, like a spider learning to walk. James and Eric ran for the truck. As they peeled out of the campsite, James glanced into the side mirror and saw it standing at the tree line, watching them leave, still smiling. They were not alone days. Later, Eric called James in the middle of the night. "Someone's outside my house," Eric whispered. I think it followed us." James sat up in bed, his heart pounding. Then, from outside his own window, he heard laughter. Story, The Basement Game. In 2017, Lily and her little brother, Max, moved into an old house with their parents. It was a fixer-upper, but it had space, a big yard, and, according to their parents, a lot of character. But what caught Max's attention the most was the basement, the door that shouldn't be there. The basement was dark, damp, and unfinished. It had a single bare light bulb and old shelves filled with junk left by the previous owners. But in the farthest corner, hidden behind a dusty cabinet, Max found a second door. A door that didn't lead anywhere. It was small, wooden, and locked tight, as if someone had sealed it from the other side. The knock-knock game. That night at dinner, Max was excited. "I found a secret door in the basement," he told his parents. His mom just laughed. "Probably just a storage closet." But Lily didn't like it. Something about the way the door was hidden felt wrong. Later that night, Lily heard whispers coming from Max's room. She peeked in and found him sitting on his bed, whispering to no one. "Max, who are you talking to?" she asked. Max looked up, smiling. "The boy in the basement." Something answers. The next day, Lily followed Max into the basement. He walked straight to the hidden door and knocked. 1, 2, 3. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, 3 knocks came back. Lily grabbed Max's hand. "We're going upstairs." But Max just grinned. "It's okay, it's just a game." That night, Lily couldn't sleep. At exactly 3 a.m., she heard it. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from underneath her floor. Through the open door. The next morning, Lily ran straight to the basement. The door, the one that had been locked shut for years, was standing wide open. Inside, there was a narrow tunnel leading into darkness. The walls were covered in deep scratches. And on the floor, tiny bare footprints in the dust. They led out of the door, but none led back in. The last game. That night, Lily woke up to Max standing beside her bed. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "Lily," he whispered, "he's in the house."